Welcome to the PBIS Academy virtual training on transitioning back to school following disruptions. I'm Marcy Handler.
And I'm Karen Robbie.
And we are here today to talk about some resources and some strategies that might be helpful as you consider transitioning back to school. First, we want to make sure that you're aware of some resources through PBIS.org that have been really helpful in responding to the COVID-19 outbreak, and some additional resources that have come out about preparing for remote learning and transitioning back to school. We'll dive deeper into that one today. And those are resources that are continually being updated as well. So we'd encourage you to go back to the PBIS.org website and look for new things as they come out in the next few months. There's also a resource available through the CDC that now talks about how schools have to help prepare, or what they need to do to prepare for students coming back. And this includes lots of strategies, for example, about what to consider with respect to hygiene routines and safe distance practices. And what I also would encourage you to review is those areas that are highlighted here that have actual visual supports and free resources right through the website on how to teach and reinforce those social behaviors. So that should help you.
And here is a list of a few additional resources. The top two, the MTSS during the pandemic, Adapting Systems of Behavior Support, and MTSS Proactively Shaping for the New Normal, are both recorded webinars that were provided to schools around how are we going to use what we already know is working and effective in schools to shape what the fall may bring. And again, strengthening our systems that we have in place, but adapting them to our new needs. And Marcy, you shared this one from NASP about some school reentry considerations it links to a lot of other resources to help with the social and emotional learning needs that may be, likely to be necessary as we move forward.
Absolutely. It had lots of great links that will be important for the students in terms of their social emotional development, and also links to how the schools as a whole need to prepare with their staff.
Great. Yeah, and I think schools are going to need a lot of that once we have some decisions made for next year.
What we thought we would help you consider today through this module is some of those practices that could be planned ahead of time in creating safe and positive and predictable learning environments. What we know has always been the case, that when there are disruptions to our learning environments or changes in the routines, creating those spaces that are safe for students, as well as providing supports for staff through effective systems, is really the key to making sure that you're prepared for any crisis that arises. So here are some things that we've considered, and some of the resources also highlight in terms of just getting prepared for that return. One might be, first and foremost, there's lots of new expectations around adult and student behavior. So it's probably necessary for you to consider your school-wide expectations, your classroom expectations, and make sure that they include language and specific behaviors on being safe, hygiene behaviors, how to navigate through new environments, etc. And that you'll need new lessons that go along with that if there's a physical return to school. In addition, it's a good time to think about those expectations and lesson plans for remote learning environments. If you haven't developed that during this time, then you may want to consider being prepared for the next interruption by having that in place with students while you have them available, either through videos and remote learning opportunities, teaching it ahead of time, for example, before anyone actually returns to school, and or considering what you'll need to reinforce once we are back.
I also think it's a really important time for us to start thinking about what do we need to have in place in terms of sharing with families ahead of time, what the expectations may be for home learning. Or one school team I talked to is thinking about the end of August, even having an online webinar for families and about how they can support students when and if the need to return to remote instruction occurs. Different things like that, thinking about how we can respond proactively rather than reacting when it inevitably changes or shifts again.
Absolutely. Any opportunities that you have to create that instruction beforehand and push that out to families and staff, I think will be incredibly valuable, so that there's not that anxiety over, will we be ready? What do we need? How can that all happen in the first few days of school? Whenever that happens, I think that will take a lot of planning beforehand before people even physically return.
Right. And an evaluation of what did work, even though this was the spring was more of an emergency remote learning situation. What were the things that worked well, and how can we leverage them to adapt and adjust for next year?
Great. One other consideration here is about the screening procedures you might want to have in place as students and staff return. It's very likely, and many of the resources refer to this, that there'll be an increase in the percentage of individuals that need additional help, either for social and emotional needs or for academic support. So it'd be great if your team also considers how to take what you might already have in place in terms of a screening mechanism, and how to include some questions or additional methods to capture those that need that support early on.
Yeah, absolutely. Making the most of the time that we have, and using it strategically will be so important.
The other feature that we've mentioned, but just as a reminder, is consider the visuals, the actual physical layouts, what additional supports you could have available. We know how important having expectations are around different locations in the school environment. And it would be great to consider some of those signs and visuals that now you'll need for new expectations. It's likely that you'll also have some routines that change both within the classroom, in the hallways, in the cafeteria, on buses, etc. And kids are going to need, and adults actually, are going to need some reminders about how to navigate through those spaces.
Absolutely. So a big thing to just remember is that we want to apply the same continuum logic that we've always used to all your different groups of stakeholders in your school. For example, if you have concerns with student engagement, if remote learning continues, how can you apply the tiered logic to that question? Are there challenges with access to technology for all students, or is it just some of them? And will some students need some structured check-ins to make sure that they're having engagement? There may be a few that need one-on-one interventions to ensure that they participate. Same idea, thinking about the staff and how they're prepared for the fall. So we know that all staff are going to need some type of regular communication and information. Some are going to have heightened levels of anxiety and need some additional support around the new expectations and circumstances. And a few may have experienced changes in their personal lives and now require accommodations. just to be thinking about how do we use what we know about our multi-tiered continuum to support in lots of different ways, and know that at each tier it may look different than it did before, but the continuum logic stays the same. So to help start thinking about some of that, it's a big lift and a big shift for everybody to be trying to problem solve right now. This is a great matrix to for planning purposes, because the school leadership's team role is to plan and prepare for all these different groups at all tiers by being proactive and responsive. So I love this as an option to just help organize some of our thinking. And then when you start doing some of that action planning and thinking ahead about what comes next, remember that the logic and principles of PBIS have not changed, right? You want to be really careful of not trying to do too much all at once. Remember to review your data, and so that you can be strategic and choose just a few key outcomes to focus on in this new normal by identifying the practices and systems that need to be in place so that those outcomes can be achieved. Does that make sense? Right? We want to do more. I'm sorry, we want to do fewer things better rather than doing a whole lot of everything all at once.
Right, absolutely. I think we're taking the same features that we were used to applying when we were teaching expectations for any of our areas and consider just, do those methods work? Are our practices in place? How do we adjust? What's a small adjustment, a big adjustment? Who needs what? I think you're right on there. If we think about our action planning then, just to give yourself some time to consider these features with your teammates, first, honestly, take a deep breath. There's a lot to plan. I think in addition to the features you wanted to have in place as you move through your school-wide behavior support planning, now you have to pivot, you have to shift, you have to look at these priorities as the new normal. What you may want to consider are things like, what would our team need to do as a first step? And that matrix may help you do that in planning for students. If there's a physical return to school or a non-physical return, but we need better routines and systems in place for remote learning. Teams are thinking about both those considerations right now. Can you make time for this planning? Are there shared documents that you can review? Are there meetings that you can do in the next few months that would actually help team members and staff feel like there's additional support there going into the development? And then how will you take some time to train and support staff in applying these new routines and practices? This really will take coordination with administration, with families, figuring out what mode is the most effective, using multiple ways of training, as you probably had to do over these last couple of months to push information out to adults. And then what layer on top of that can you begin to develop that will help train or support or teach these new expectations to students so that they'll be more in line with each other and more consistent and more comfortable returning to any environment that has to be put in place for September. Thanks for taking the time to review this module. If you want any additional support, we encourage you to reach out to your trainers and follow up with your team members. In addition, continue to refer back to the PBIS.org or any PBIS website for additional resources that will be coming out in the next few months.
Yeah, they've got a lot coming ahead. Thanks, everyone.